Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day. Welcome to another edition of the Moggcast. This is Paul Goodman, editor of Conservative Home, in conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg. Jacob, good morning.
Good morning, Paul.
Jacob, at the moment I'm reading John Biffin's Inside the Commons, and I wanted to check a detail about the office of the Leader of the House, which is in the book. John Biffin, who, if the readers don't know, for some of you younger ones, was a prominent politician in the age of Mrs. Thatcher and a former Leader of the House himself, he wrote in this guide, "The Leader of the House's room in the Commons is handsomely furnished with Pugin panelling, desk, chairs and clock." This is the same room, is it, that John Biffin would have been writing about?
I don't actually think it is. I think the Leader of the House and the Home Secretary swapped rooms not that long ago, but since John Biffin's time, because of the larger outer office for the Leader's office, or what was the Home Secretary's office, to provide more space for the civil servants. So I think it's very similar, but it is not the identical office.
It is handsomely furnished, and I suppose the question that follows from that is it also handsomely furnished with a CCTV camera?
I thought you might ask me that. I think there aren't CCTV cameras in any offices in the Palace of Westminster, for obvious reasons about the executive looking in on legislators, and it's hard to see that that would be right. There have been discussions on CCTV cameras in public areas, which is obviously a different matter. But there is up there a fire alarm that went in relatively recently, a smoke detector. So let's hope that that hasn't got some little bit of kit tucked away in it, though actually there's not a lot they would find out that was very exciting if they had a CCTV camera there.
I mean, you did say you think. Are you sure?
I'm not sure, but I can't see any CCTV camera in this room, and as far as I'm aware, there aren't any in private offices in the Palace of Westminster.
What's the point of having them in departmental ministers' offices as opposed to in Parliament?
I can't see any point. It seems a strange place to have a CCTV camera. It's quite interesting. We've got so used in this country to CCTV cameras being everywhere and the argument for security and so on and so forth. But one should never forget the civil liberties argument against them, that there are CCTV cameras everywhere in China. And governments less benign than our own use CCTV coverage for their own purposes. So I think this is in some ways a reminder that if you have CCTV cameras, what you think is in private may be more public than you had anticipated.
Do you think this very morning, as ever, I'd have to say to the listeners, you're listening on Tuesday, and this is a Monday morning and fairly early by Moggcast standards. Do you think this moment, the very first thing cabinet ministers have done as they return to their offices this week is have a grand sweep to find out how many CCTV cameras there are in Whitehall?
I don't know. I mean, I haven't raised the question on coming in here that the Leader's office doesn't deal with matters of high state security. We can afford to be relatively open about what we do, but I would assume that, as with major corporations, offices are kept secure.
Let me move on to the subject after the Matt Hancock resignation business of non-executive directors of departments. For better or worse, I'm a great fan of non-exec directors. And I think there are some very good ones with something special to offer. There's Lord Agnew. Now I think in the Cabinet Office with his business experience as Lord Nash, who, like Lord Agnew, is really an education hand. He's experienced in the charitable world. There's Gisela Stewart in the Cabinet Office, who was a very senior MP under Labour and a real thinker. But I think a lot of people are asking, what is it that, I hope I'm not mispronouncing her name, Gina Coladangelo, brought to the party at the Department of Health to be a non-exec?
Well, first of all, I think you're absolutely right. It's very important to have good non-executive directors, and the ones you mention are all absolutely first class. There are others I could mention too. But you need to appoint people who want the government to succeed. The non-executive directors are not there to be the civil servants. They are there to drive the success of the department in a different way. So the civil servants are there to drive the success of the department according to the fiat of the minister. But the non-executive directors are there to challenge and say, you could do things differently and better, but they need to be on the side of the minister concerned. So what did the lady in question bring? I don't know, but there was a process for her appointment, and that process is one that is carried out independently to make sure that people have qualifications to carry out their role.
If her relationship with Matt Hancock had begun before she was appointed as a non-exec, would the appointment have been proper?
I don't know about individual appointments, and I don't know about individual relationships, and nor would it be right that I should. So it may be easier to talk in generic terms, but in generic terms, a member of parliament who has an employee with whom he or she then develops a relationship is expected to declare that to IPSA, because there are limitations on family members and restrictions on family members you may employ. So in a parliamentary context, IPSA would have had to have been informed, and there are rules around that. And I think there are likely to be rules around disclosure of personal relationships in other areas too.
So were there to have been a relationship prior to appointment, it would have had to be declared?
I'm, with Queen Elizabeth I, not liking to make windows into men's souls, and therefore for me to start speculating about whether relationships between a couple of individuals existed or not is frankly none of my business.
I'm asking a general question there in this case.
If we're asking general questions, if a man were to appoint his wife to be a non-executive director, you would hope that the Cabinet office knew that the lady was married to the man.
I've not seen the Prime Minister for quite a while, but I used to work with him and I know something about the way his mind works. Prime Minister will think that a mass of apparent or even real scandals that the media hurl at his door are best responded to by, in Churchill's phrase, keeping buggering on, right? Don't give the media pack what it wants. Once you do, the wolves will be back for more. And it seems to me to have been a principle that he applied in this case after Matt Hancock apologised. Do you think he was right? Do you think in this case an apology was good enough?
Well, you set out this very clearly in a very interesting piece for The Times the morning before we're actually discussing it, but no doubt people listening can look it up. I think one of the Prime Minister's many attractive qualities is his loyalty to the people who work for him. I think this is a strength, and I think it engenders loyalty in return. And you know the principle of collective responsibility. You want ministers who not only support the government line because it's the government line, but support it because they back the Prime Minister and they want him to succeed, and if that's his line, they're for it. And that requires loyalty in return. And I think that is a great strength of the Prime Minister. And in spite of the Prime Minister's loyalty, the Secretary of State has gone, former Secretary of State has gone, because his actions were incompatible with the office that he held. And he recognised that.
But you think the Prime Minister was essentially right to believe an apology was enough?
I think that loyalty is an extremely attractive characteristic and is beneficial to the leadership that the Prime Minister provides to this country.
All right, well, you're clearly not going to say, nor do I think you think, that the Prime Minister was wrong. So we'll leave that matter there. I mean, do you think it's fair to say, just emerging from this exploration into his character that I'm trying to undertake, that Boris Johnson has a more relaxed attitude than some politicians to rules and conventions?
I think that's a misconstruction. I think the Prime Minister recognises that a lot of rows in public life are basically synthetic. And so if a government responds to every synthetic row, you have a merry-go-round of ministers, you have absolute chaos and nothing happens. That most rows are, the opposition doesn't like something the government's doing and they try and pin it on an individual minister, or you have some fantastic circumstance that people say, ha, that must be terrible. Let us take an example. A minister happens to sit next to somebody at a dinner. Nothing happened. There was no impropriety. The press gets frightfully excited for a couple of days, and it quite rightly passes into the mists of time. And it's really important to recognise that there is an awful lot of froth on the top of the political sea, foam bubbling away, and that prime ministers do better if they don't react to that all the time. Indeed, I think it was one of the weaknesses of Theresa May's administration is that she responded to every bit of froth that arose.
For example, it's a well-known fact he's sometimes, he's been at least once late with his declaration in the registry of interests. Doesn't bother you, does it, this lack of willingness to dot the I's and cross the T's on time?
I think what you want to know is that your Prime Minister is an honest man, and the Prime Minister is unquestionably an honest man. Do you want to know that the Prime Minister is a leading bureaucrat? Well, no, then we'd still be in the European Union and he could be the European President. But we don't want that. We want an honest man as Prime Minister, and Boris Johnson is an honest man. This is getting very American. That in the American system, you have all sorts of fusses about irrelevant technicalities that have nothing to do whether the country is well run or not. Has a form been correctly filled out? But that's not the type of country this is. This country is, are our leaders good people doing a good job, and are they honest? And the Prime Minister fits all of those criteria.
Completely different question, but very much one in your field and one you will have thought about a lot. Over the course of, say, the last 25, 30 years, would it be true to say that the powers of the executive have waxed and those of the legislative have waned?
There was a debate in the House of Commons in the 18th century that the powers of the Crown have increased, are increasing, and should be diminished. I think it has been a constant complaint of Parliament that its powers are being subsumed into the executive. I think the powers of the state as a whole have increased enormously over the last 100 years. That's because of the increase in public expenditure as a percentage of GDP. So the government is involved in so many more areas of our lives. And the increase in regulation that has come with that as we're directed in all sorts of areas. And of course, a lot of what happened in the immediate post-Second World War Labour government that socialised a lot of previously private activity. So the power of the state has increased, but I'm not sure the balance between the executive and the legislature has changed that much. I think it depends on a number of things. It depends partly on the majority. The executive is more powerful when it has a big majority, in theory, but as you've been studying, MPs are more rebellious now than they were in the 1950s. So in the 1950s, a government with a modest majority had much greater control of Parliament than a government now with a big majority. The House of Lords, since the hereditary left, has, for better or worse, exercised its powers much more aggressively than it did when the hereditaries were still there. So no, I think this is a constant fear. It's much like the fear that all our previous leaders were statesmen and now we only have politicians. This is a recurring theme of human nature, and I don't think it's much changed.
I'm, for what it's worth, trying to think it through myself, and I think there are arguments one way and there are arguments the other. But I just want to sort of finish with one observation about it. The payroll vote, official or unofficial, has got bigger, hasn't it? Because of the government's habit. Actually, I'll scrap government's habit. This has been going on for a while, of appointing trade envoys or other special people who are under an obligation to the government and are therefore expected not usually to vote against it.
Most MPs don't usually vote against the government anyway. I think you've just had a list of the most rebellious MPs on Conservative Home. And what do you have? You have the most rebellious vote against the government 9 times on important issues. So even those who are rebellious are routinely voting with the government. I have in front of me, which wasn't deliberate, but they're still here, those 2 folders, which are for bills that are going to be considered at the committee later on today. They have within them the views of lots and lots of backbench MPs and peers, which are taken into account as legislation is considered to ensure that what is being done has the support of both houses. And so although when they come to the floors of both houses, you will expect their passage to be reasonably smooth, great deal of work and consideration and consultation has gone ahead of that formalised part of it on the floor of the House. Now, I think the power of the Commons, and indeed of the Lords, is not always as visible as it is in reality when you're sitting as a minister saying, how do I get my bill through? And you're talking to your cabinet and other ministerial colleagues, you are saying, well, that'll be difficult because Fred will raise that point and he's got some supporters and so on and so forth. And this is the sort of hidden bit of our constitution, the dark matter of our constitution, things that go on privately, but bring very much the scrutiny and democratic element, particularly of what the House of Commons is saying, to the forefront of ministers' minds. They don't stand up when somebody intervenes on them on the floor of the House and say, good heavens, that's a brilliant point, old Bean, we'll definitely change legislation to do that, because all that work should have gone on beforehand.
This is a fascinating subject, and we will return to it in due course. For better or worse, we've had to take up much of the Moggcast with reflecting on issues arising from Matt Hancock's resignation, but we will get back to it. I've enjoyed this conversation very much as ever. Jacob Rees-Mogg, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, and I must read John Biffin's book.
The Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.